Caribbean and Latino Studies. I want to welcome you all to this brown bag event. We are very lucky to have Danilo Buscato Medeiros as our visiting postdoctoral fellow for these 2 weeks, right? And happy to have this platform to share his work and his conversation with Professor Andrea Mercades de Freitas today. I will introduce Ana Flavia Badue, who will be moderating the discussion today and presenting the panelists with more detail. And I also want to let you all know that we're recording this event. So in case you don't want your name to be displayed in the recording, you can change your names or take the necessary precautions for that. And we will have some presentations, discussion, and then some time for questions for the audience. But in the meantime, you can also write your questions on the chat and we'll gather them at the end of the, after the presentations. All right, thank you everybody. And I'll give the floor to Ana Flavia, who is a postdoctoral candidate at the in cultural anthropology at the Graduate Center as well.
Thank you, Andreina. Thank you all for coming. So today's panel is going to talk about some questions that are timely, and we are going to focus on Brazil, but at the same time, we expect these questions to be transplanted to other countries in Latin America as well. So what are the relationships between the way politicians work and make decisions and the events and trends that happen at the society at large? What are the points of contact between legislators and citizens? And what are the methods that we can use to analyze the infiltration of economic, social, and cultural phenomena into the legislative arena? We are actually used to think and reflect on how politicians affect our lives, but the panel today is asking us or inviting us to do the opposite and to ask how do we and our social interactions and the social phenomena that happens outside of the political arena infiltrate in the political arena. As an example, before the military coup in Brazil in 1964, the nation was divided around many issues, and one of them being land reforms. The left vouched for redistribution of agrarian land, while the right looked for keeping the colonial land structure inherited from slave-based plantations that organized property relations. The military coup was an institutional reflection of this social polarization, or the political parties could not find common ground to negotiate due to structural conditions. This is just an example of the questions that we are raising here today. And as I think we are going to do here is to think of how these questions can be translated to the present and to other Latin American contexts. For example, what will happen in Colombian presidential elections? The party organizations, how is it going to happen after the demonstrations that took place in the country during the pandemic, for example? Do social upheavals impact institutional politics? And what are other rupturing events and trends and factors that impact on institutional politics, like economic inequalities? So today, Danilo and Andrea are going to respond to some of these questions. Andrea Freitas is a professor of political science at Unicamp, the State University of Campinas. She coordinates the political institutions and elections clusters at the Brazilian Center for Analysis and Planning, SEBRAP. She's also a researcher at the Center for Comparative and International Studies at University of São Paulo and the Center for Studies on Public Opinion at Unicamp. Her main interests are legislative studies, coalition in government, executive legislative relationships, and political parties. Danilo, who will speak after Andrea, is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Brazilian Center for Analysis and Planning, SEBRAP, and a visiting professor at São Paulo School of Economics at Getúlio Vargas Foundation. Danilo's scholarship focuses on the relationship between economic inequality among citizens on the one hand and political polarization at institutional level on the other hand. He has also been developing rigorous methodological approaches to investigate the relationship between both. Each of them will talk for 15 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation. So I encourage you all to type your questions or raise your hand on Zoom, because the idea is to make it informal. So if you have questions right after the conversation, you feel free to ask them. Okay, so thank you all. Thank you, Cockles, for hosting the event, and have a good talk.
Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure met you today. I'd like to thank you, the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to share my impressions and discuss with you this moment that is going through Brazil, but also is going in many countries around the world. Unfortunately, this is a moment that not being specific about Brazil, and the process that leads to polarization in Brazil, I think is similar to what is happening in many other countries, especially in Latin America. So I'm going to talk about the rise of political polarization in Brazil and its consequences to democratic regime. This is an ongoing process. We still don't know the results yet, and I'm not sure that I can answer all those questions that Anna asked. I will talk more about impressions, not really about answers, definitive answers. I don't have any definitive answers, but I will try to share with you what I think is three critical moments that Brazil passed in the last 20 years. That I think is common ground in many countries. First, mass protests to fierce political opposition that lead an impeachment process, barely crossing the line of the legality. Impeachment is not a common ground process, but we have a lot of fierce political opposition that sometimes change the government. And the third process, an election of an anti-system candidate for the president. I think these three moments, or critical moments, these three aspects of Brazilian political system are pretty much what's happening in many countries. I would like to start sharing with you 1 minute. Let's see, where is my presentation? Okay. Well, I would like to start sharing with you guys 3 pictures that I think express very well this rising of political polarization in Brazil. The first picture in the right, I think it's right for you too, I'm not sure. The first picture is protests that I'm sorry. In the first pictures in the right, we see protests that happens in 1992 that ask for the impeachment of the president at the time, Fernando Collor. In the center, we see a picture of June 2013 protests. Some people call it the Brazilian Spring. I'm not sure that is the right way to call, but I use because it's common sense. In the third, this time is 2015, a protest asking for the Dilma Rousseff's impeachment. I would like to draw your attention to the symbolic repertoire that are present in this protests. The colors of the that were showing in the protests. In the first picture, we have flags, party flags, we have Brazilian flags, we have a lot of different symbols. In the middle, we have, we don't have party flags, we have much more messages from the people to outside. And in the third, we have this yellow and green that are the colors of our flag, of Brazilian flag. And it's pretty much, I think it's clear the difference between the three pictures. And that, to make what I want to say clear, here we have pro-government and anti-government. We are talking now about Bolsonaro's government, a pro-government and anti-government protest. And then we see the pro-government, it's yellow and green, and the anti-government is black and red. And that that's for me represent very well the what is political polarization in Brazil. It's not more about people sharing ideas, the cleavage between the groups is very clear. We can see that looking to the to how the protests evolve in the time in Brazil. In this graphics and the right graphic, we can see hi guys,
Andrea.
can you, oh, hello?
Yeah,
Are you, now you are here? You are okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Still sharing the presentation with you? Okay.
It is, but it's small.
Ah, okay. Let me do bigger. 1 minute, please. I'm not sure what's happening. I will stop and start again the sharing. Now it's okay? Yes? These graphics are from a paper from Luciana Totajiba and Andrea Galvão. We see the main argument that they do in this paper is that this cycle of protests in Brazil started in 2011 and not in 2013 when they really explode. And what she is trying, what they are trying to explain is that are a very, it's a changing in the way the protests are making and what the people asking for in these protests. As you can see at the graphic in the top here, if the protests are asking in 2011 for better working conditions, in 2016 the protests changing what they are asking for and passed to be pretty much about anti-government protests. And when we look only for this kind of protest, this anti-government protests, we can see that's pretty much about an anti-PT working party, Labor Party in Brazil that was party of Lula parties, Dilma's party, the party who are at the government from 2003 to 2015. And that reflects on the party system. Here we can see the party fragmentation or the number of chairs that the 4 main parties in Brazil has from 1987 to 2019. And as we can see, when you look for the graphic, these 4 main parties in Brazil lose a lot of their representation in the chamber, and the other parties increase his part in the chamber. The same you can see when we look for the votes. When you look for the votes for the 2 main parties in Brazil, we can see they have about 30% of the votes in 2003, and then in 2019 he has less than 20%, and of course that reflects in the chairs in the chamber. Oh, sorry. And the party fragmentation explodes. and that lead a political system that has in the chamber about 16 effective legislative parties. That's some images and some pictures I start to share with you, and then me and Danilo can talk more about and explain better what these pictures means and how that can reflect in the Brazilian regime. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Now, Danilo, please. You have the floor.
Calma. Andrea, acho que você precisa. You need to stop your sharing before I can share my. Okay, thank you. Okay, let me share my presentation. Thank you, Andrea, for your presentation, and thank you for accepting this invitation. So I invited Andrea to join me so we can make a conversation, an informal conversation on this brown bag. So thank you for accepting and preparing a very nice presentation. I hope mine will complement yours a little bit, and then we can talk more on the Q&A. Okay, here we go. So I would like first to thank the center for having me here today, for organizing this brown bag, and for having me as a visiting fellow for these 2 weeks that I'm here in New York. And thank you, a special thank you to Sebastian, Andreina, and Lydia for making this happen, for organizing the panel, for putting the flyer out there. So thank you all for that. And thank you all who are watching us today or maybe later on the YouTube. So I'm Danilo, as Ana told everyone. So I'm a postdoctoral fellow at CEBRAP in São Paulo, Brazil. I have been working on polarization for quite such time right now. But my focus is on what's going on in Congress. So my research to this point focused on polarization in Congress. And this is not something trivial, because especially in the US, where I think has the literature on polarization is pretty huge. Polarization almost always focuses on what was going on Congress, on the US Congress. But since the 2000s, especially, people start looking what was going on the what they call the mass level, so what is going on with voters. And my research tries to put this together and understand what's going on in Brazil and maybe also other countries from the global south. So to start, like, we live in strange times, right? It's a period of radicalization, a period of polarization in general. And this is not a Brazilian phenomena or an American phenomena, right? So we hear again and again and again and again that we live in these weird periods, but we are going through, right? We don't know, as Andrea said, we don't know what will be the result of all these. We know that there are some polarizing forces and some depolarizing movements all over the world, especially in democracies, but we don't know exactly the full consequences of these. But what we know that there have been many publications, not only academic publications or papers in journals, but publications that are produced to the general public that are focusing on this issue, right? Like how polarization might threaten democracy, or especially in the case of the American case, especially in the American case, there are many publications asking if it's the case of polarization threatening the democracy here in the US, because this was unthinkable for most of the American politics literature, right? Democracy, it was given that democracy was solid and that polarization was an issue, but not an issue to get as big as something that could threaten democracy. So, but what is polarization? What are we talking about? So, Poole and Rosenthal, who have like this canonical work on the American Congress, they are basically the first one to present some systematic data on how polarization evolves in the US since the 19th, the beginning of the 90s. So they have this definition of what polarities are. Is a state of having two opposite or contradictory aspects, tendencies, and opinions. So basically polarization, you have polarization when policy and ideological differences between two groups have grown. These two groups could be parties or party affiliations, right? When voters are affiliated or when parties identify with some of these two parties. And this is the case in Brazil. And I like to, every time that I do a presentation on polarization, I like to bring this New Yorker comic, because I guess it's kind of what we believe in general, what polarization is, especially when we are talking more broadly in the public debate and not like an academic debate. So someone starts pushing an agenda, the other group, the other bloc responds with some intensity, and then it becomes something of us versus them on one issue or on many issues, right? To the point that we cannot fit we cannot be in the same room, and maybe we don't fit in the same democracy, and so the us versus them can threaten democracy when one of these sides, one of these blocks decide that there is no space for other system of beliefs or other existences. So I'll present a lot of data today. Some data I produce, some data I just gather around. So then we can have a sense of what is going on in Brazil and in Latin America in general and other countries as well. So here we have a picture from a graph from the VDEM, from the Varieties of Democracy data, comparing their measure of political polarization since the 50s in Latin America with two measures that they have on democracy. One focused on electoral institutions, and one is a more broader definition of liberal democracy. As you can see, polarization was pretty high after the Second World War in Latin America, but we had a depolarization movement after the transition, the many transitions to democracy that happened in the region in the end of the 80s. So in democracy, the democracy index kind of follows this pattern, right? So it was pretty low. It was close to the minimum of the value that they have in their data. It grows, it goes up as countries in the region starts to transact, to move to democracy. But now we have a situation where polarization, and polarization here, it's important to mention that polarization here for the VDEM project is basically, it's very close to what we saw in the comic before. It's when you have opposing views on many issues to the point that people cannot no longer live pacifically, or can live without tension in the same country or in the same region. Where and they also put this on the coding information. They also mentioned that polarization for them is when families or friends or any community group cannot discuss politics without this being a pretty big issue that can go to physical matters. But now we have a situation where polarization starts rising again after the beginning the 2000s, and democracy is kind of stable, but we have some bumps here, right? We have some decreasing effects. But although we can see a correlation here, we are not sure if polarization is causing some democratic backsliding. So just focus a little bit on the figure for political polarization. Green is Brazil. We have also some data for the European Union, the Latin American and the Caribbean in general, and the USA. The USA is a pretty important case here because it's the case that everyone mentions in this discussion and this literature. So polarization was low and kind of stable since the Second World War till the 2000s, and then you can see that skyrocketed, right? Now it's close to 4. That's in the VDEM rating, 4 is the highest. And Brazil is up there with the US right now. After the transition to democracy, you have a depolarization movement. And then, but Brazil polarization rose back again later, right? Just in the 2010s, and then skyrocketed. The rating here doubled. But you can see some depolarization and then polarization more recently in the European Union and in Latin American and the Caribbean in general. So it's not only something that's happening in few countries, right? It's happening in many places, in many democracies, but the extent is different and varies considerably. I'll change gears a little bit before going back to Brazil and political polarization specifically in Brazil. This graph show how the percentage of democracies in the Americas and Europe since the Second World War. You can see that since the 2000s and actually since the 90s, democracy became basically the only game in town, right? In both continents. After the Berlin Wall fell, you basically do not have another option on the table, right? You are a democracy. The countries in these regions are basically democracies, and this is kind of stable for over the period. And here is a measure of democracy, very minimalist, and you don't have variation on the level of democracy for this graph. So I'm here relying on Tversky and other authors who classify democracy as dichotomous variable, right? You are a democracy or you are not. But this data is not updated. It ends in 2010, so we have to update this data and check if this is still the case. So, but democracy is all over the Americas and Europe. But what is going on with competition in these countries? So we have a graph that was first presented by Tversky. So we have the proportion of parties that were the 2 top vote winners around 1924 that remain in the top 2. So what we have here is clearly that the top parties are losing their grip continuously. But so we need other competitors entering competition here, right? And this is a point that Professor Limongi made before, that if there is a threat, actually, the threat comes from inside, from the very working of the political system, from new and emerging forces, not from the forces that were here since before, since the organization of the party systems in these democracies. So we have to look to what is going on these new and emerging forces in these democracies. And another part that Professor Limongi made, he noticed that so this is turnout in elections in these Western Europe democracies. Turnout was pretty big in after the Second World War, but has been decreasing continuously. And you actually have, like, for the UK and Germany, some increase recently. But in general, the figure is that, at least in these rich democracies, people are not showing up to vote. People are not getting out and voting. And this is a phenomena pretty common in many countries. It's not something that's going on in Brazil and many Latin American countries, in part because here we have compulsory voting. But it's, when you don't have compulsory voting, basically voters are not showing up to vote. So you have something interesting. You have polarization, and at the same time you have some kind of apathy, right? There are people who are polarized. There are voters who become like talking about politics became a pretty big issue. But there are many voters who are not interested in showing up to vote. So there's something I don't have a complete answer for this paradox, but it's something that we can discuss later. But let's talk a little bit more of how this paradox takes place to understand what is causing political polarization in Brazil and elsewhere. So there are some explanations for polarization, and cause is a big word, right? It's complicated to define if there is one factor causing polarization, but maybe altogether we can present a picture of what is going on. So one of the main explanations for political polarization is centered around socioeconomic features, especially rising inequality. So rising inequality has been presented as the main factor that caused polarization, especially in the US. Why? So inequality tend to, so rising inequality, especially not only income inequality in general, but rising economic inequality tend to put people apart, right? So when you have like a big middle class, people tend to have the same preferences, especially around taxation and redistribution. But with rising inequality, you have you tend to have people moving towards the extremes in especially these matters of well-being and redistribution. So this tends to create some polarization in the electorates, and also some polarization in the political elites. And this differentiation is important, right? We have two types of polarization that we can assess. We can assess polarization in the voters, polarization in the masses, and polarization in the political elite, or in partisan politics or in Congress. And although they may be connected, there are many evidence presented for the American case showing that this is not the case in the US for quite such a long time. So the correlation between polarization in the masses and in the political elites is just statistically significant starting in the 90s. Another possible factor causing polarization is partisan or political realignments. And the example here is the Southern realignment in the US. So after the civil rights in the 60s, the civil rights movement in the US in the 60s, you have a political realignment in the South. So you have voters moving their votes from the Democrats to the Republicans, and this made a shift that ended with polarization. Also, party competition for institutional control and party leaders' strategy and party pressure. The idea here is that when parties are competing for control, for example, of both the presidency and the houses of Congress, the chambers of Congress, this will put a lot of pressure in legislators to toe the party line, and the party line may need to differentiate from the other party in order to guarantee these majorities. There's also a lot of there are many publications on the effect of new media technologies, but also on old media technologies, right? There is a recent publication on how Fox News watchers, like people that watch Fox News all over the time, there was an experiment where they had to watch CNN for a whole month, and they changed their views. They changed their views in many issues, and these are real Trump voters. And then they start talking on the interviews about racial equality, about abortion, on views that are not close to the ones that are being displayed on CNN. But especially the publications and the discussion about the influence of social media is all over the place, right? We have some papers showing that this has an effect on polarization, some papers showing that there are no effects. So it's new territory and we need more publication on that. And there is like a indirect effect of polarization that get into the system again. So when you have polarizing systems, and this is a point defended by political science Daniel Thompson, when you already have polarization, so the moderates, they flip public life. And her example is like members of state legislatures who were able to enter the competition and to try to get a seat in the National Congress, but they are moderate, right? They are like close to the center of the ideological spectrum. They feel they don't have a chance of being elected, and more, they feel that once elected, they wouldn't be able to pass their agenda because they are moderate, and they feel like because of polarization, the views in Congress today are really extreme, and with a moderate agenda, they wouldn't be able to produce something, to produce a piece of legislation. So they flip public life, or they just stay in the state legislature and they don't move on to the national level. So then we have basically the extremists who are in Congress, right? And there's another thing that's going on. When a moderate shows up to the primaries in the US, they tend not to be selected. So extremists are more likely to be selected in primaries than moderates, and this has a second effect on polarization. So what are the consequences of polarization? Although polarization is always used to define a dysfunctional system, right? Especially in the public debate. But the thing is that there is also a positive effect, because voters can differentiate between parties when there is polarization, and you tend to have the representation of unheard voices, and you have to remember that in the 50s, the political science association here in the US was complaining that parties were not representing unheard voices. They are basically the same, so voters didn't really have a choice. They wanted parties to have to present different political agendas, and when you have at least some level of polarization, you have space for this, right? The thing is when to define what's a good limit on that, and you have some negative effects of polarization as well. As gridlock in Congress, you cannot pass anything, so you decrease also legislative productivity. There is data showing that when polarization is high, there are few important new pieces of legislation, and one of the consequences presented by the literature is democratic backsliding. The problem starts with this us versus them mindset and political identity that pulls apart people. But there is also a mechanism presented by Milan Zvolek recently, showing that voters trade off democratic principles for partisan interests when polarization is high. So they are, if the leaders, if the party leaders in a polarized democracy move to threaten democracy, they will go with it, and they will just support these ideas, even if they before supported the democratic principles. So just to move on to polarization in Brazil, I'm showing a graph. It's not, I think it's not really good to see it, but actually I will start with polarization in the US. So this is a very nice graph showing the perfect, almost perfect correlation between the Gini index in the US and polarization measured as the distance between the median position of both parties in the US. So this correlation is stark. And so everyone has been looking into their own countries to see if this is the case elsewhere. Let me just go back a little bit. So this is the position of the main parties in Brazil since we transitioned back to democracy. We have, so the Workers' Party, the PT, was always on the left of the spectrum, but it tended to move to the center once it became the party of the president. Once they are in the presidency, they kind of moderated, but slightly moved back to the extreme. And extreme here in comparison to others, right? I'm not showing all parties in Brazil. As Andrea showed, we have many parties in Congress, and this position is based on the position, this measure is based on the position taken by legislators in the Brazilian Chamber of Deputies. We have the PSDB, who was another party in the president for 8 years when Fernando Henrique Cardoso was the president. It moved to the extreme right once the Workers' Party was in the presidency. And you have a lot of smaller parties that are kind of going to the center of the spectrum because they want this position where they can be in the coalition, in the government coalition, no matter who is the president. I just go quickly through this so you can see that there are other ways to measuring polarization and to measure legislative behavior in general before going to the measure of polarization. So here I measured the position of the parties based on speeches, actually, rather than votes in Congress. So you have the PSDB, the party of Cardoso, in the right, and PT on the left, and then many parties in the center. And we can move on to the Workers' Party presidencies. It's kind of the same image, although you have some movement on the parties that were in the government coalition. But yeah, just another possibility of measuring legislative behavior, that we can use that to measure polarization. Because this is a challenge, right? Because the polarization measures were created for parties with for systems with two parties. And then when you have multiple parties, it's hard to define these two blocks that are opposed, that have opposing views. And in Brazil, this was organized by this coalition opposition divide. So you have two blocks that are, at least in Congress, that are organized through this opposition and government coalition line. So let me show you some data on rising polarization under different political and socioeconomic circumstances. I have, because Anna asked a lot of questions. Anna mentioned the 46 to 64 democracy, and we can see that the polarization was rising before the coup in 1964. Then we don't have data for the military dictatorship period. And then after we transitioned back to democracy, polarization was pretty low and it rose quickly. So it increased quickly in the second term of President Cardoso. And then when Lula and the Workers' Party got to the presidency, when Workers' Party was inaugurated in power, so you have like this amazing increase. And actually, during Dilma's, that's impressive and unexpected. During Dilma's presidency, it decreased, polarization decreased up to the point that increased a little bit again before the 2018 elections. Some answers for that. And here we have data on the top income share, so to try to get this relationship between inequality and polarization in Brazil, but we don't have data for many years. This data is based on IRS, Brazilian IRS returns, and also on surveys. So I'm political science. I like numbers. I just put these, but I don't have time to explain the model and everything that's going on. What is important here is that we have actually a negative relationship between concentration of income and polarization. So when the concentration of income in the top 1% increases, you have a decrease in polarization considering the 1946 to 64 period. And for the post-1988, so for post the transition back to democracy, you also have a negative effect, but this time only when you rely on survey, on household survey data. So, but it's also a decreasing effect. So it's a negative effect of concentration of income in the top 1%, or even the Gini index and polarization. I'll go quickly through these, but there is also a relationship on there's also a conditional effect of the status towards the coalition. So the effect is negative only when only considering legislators who are in the coalition, and a positive effect on the opposition. And it's important to notice that this graph is showing data considering the individual legislators, and these data are for the national level. So we have also something to study there, this difference between analyzing data at the national level, aggregated at the national level, and data for the individual level, so the specific legislator. And here we are not talking exactly about polarization, because there is no polarization at the individual level. Here we are talking more about the influences on extremism. And we have influences that comes from income inequality through voter preferences and the pressures of parties over these individuals. So I took a lot of time, so I'll just conclude with that. So the deconcentration of income was associated in general with greater effective enfranchisement of poor voters in Brazil, which in and of itself was a highly contentious issue among political parties that drove polarization. And also historical conditions led the Brazilian elite and the middle class to go against projects that prompted changes in power structures and social hierarchies. I didn't discuss that, so you have to believe me on that, but we can talk a little bit more on the Q&A. And also democratic backsliding probably is not a direct and automatic consequence of political polarization, but suicidal party strategies, emerging extremist political forces, and political actors willing to overturn elections are key. So political polarization doesn't do the work by itself. And we also have a puzzling result. So while democracy should ideally foster economic equality, its realization stimulates political polarization, which is, at least as pointed out by part of the literature, a potential threat to democracy. So I guess we still need more studies on the global South, because we just basically have data and analysis on advanced industrial democracies, and I hope to contribute to the discussion, and I would love to see other researchers going around for the global South. That's it. Thank you. Sorry for taking so much time.
Thank you, Danilo. Thank you, Andrea, again. So we can, if you have questions, again, please type your questions, or if you want to raise your hand, feel free to do so. Can I start with a question, or Andrea and Danilo, did you think of something like a question you want to ask each other? There is a question from Carlos here. Carlos, can you open your mic, or do you prefer to type?
Sure. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for this conversation. It has been like extremely interesting. I have two super quick questions. One, it's on this relationship between polarization and diversity, of what we're understanding as polarization is just like a normal, quote unquote, normal consequence of having a more diverse pool of politicians, but also values and actors in the political sphere. So rather like using Danilo's cartoon of having two people with two balloons, what we're seeing more on like a more Latin American Brazilian cartoon, it's more like 55 balloons that are pushing to each other. So I don't know if there's something to say between diversity and polarization, kind of. And then thinking within the reasons of why we're seeing Congress is more polarized, I wanted to ask you, to both of you, something first related to like Danilo mentioned some reasons about polarization, but why polarization is happening. But I would like you to ask, especially from the Brazilian perspective, what's the role that you see about religious and religious forces being part of the political scenario, more like different to what the Catholic Church used to do, more like funding parties and like making very clear that that's the voice that they wanted to represent. That's one. And then second, also the interaction of new political actors as social movements, if they're like bringing also other ways of polarization. And I know that we know better about like the social movements on the left, but what about the social movements on the right? I'm thinking the pro-life social movement, etc. So yeah, thank you again, and this has been extremely useful. Obviously, I would love to hear your thoughts on everything that's going to happen in the elections in Brazil, but stop that and leave that for other people. And thank you again.
Can I also make a question before that, because I think it's related to Carlos' question. And thank you, Carlos, for your question. I have a question for Andrea, actually, especially because of the picture that you showed about rising party fragmentation in Brazil. And this is an important issue, and I guess it's connected to what Carlos was saying, because I want to hear more from you. How do you think like party fragmentation is connected to polarization, or what are the challenges that arise from party fragmentation to the political system, to the party system, right? So because I'll give some examples of the problem in the discussion on polarization when you move from the US to other countries. So here the literature just focused the divide between Democrats and Republicans. Basically, you just measure the different positions of Democrats and Republicans, both in the electorate or and also in Congress or the partisan politics. But when you move away from the US or even the UK, you have a big problem, right? And people who are studying these are finding solutions that are not the best, but I think there's no easy way around. So, for example, there are some studies in France that focus on the two main parties, and they see in Congress or in the electorate how these parties are close or distant from each other. But this is a problem in a country as France that you have like this evolving party system, new parties emerging, and it's not easy especially because the two main parties change from one election to another. So I just want to hear more about what you think about the relation or the challenges of party or of fragmentation and polarization in Brazil and also more generally elsewhere, right? Like what do you think is the connection here? And then after, I don't know, and are you gathering more questions or we answer Carlos?
I think Andrea has just asked a question to Andrea. Maybe Andrea can start answering the two questions, then you can answer, Danilo, and then other people might raise their hands as well.
Okay. Let me see if I can answer Carlos. This is a very interesting question because the cartoon that Danilo shows with two balloons, I feel pretty much represented by this cartoon. In Brazil, it's not we have so many questions in the society, yes, about inequality, about Black people representation, about women representation, about Brazil has so many issues that we can talk about that all day, and we cannot talk about all the issues. But when the society is pretty much divided between between two sides. Even we have 16 balloons in the Congress, but they not really represent all this variety of ideas and ideologies. I don't think that has so many ideologies in the world. We are basically divided between conservative people who are against how can I say, people who are pro-family values, people who are against environment defense, who are thinking that global warming do not exist. People, this kind of people, and from the other side, people who are who want to more liberal issues. I will put in this way, and we have I almost bring that a cartoon in Brazil that talk about labor reform, labor reforms, that happened in Brazil, and then has someone with a yellow shirt, pro-Bolsonaro, because if yellow is pro-Bolsonaro, we can deduce that. And here are talking, oh, we don't have any rights anymore. And then someone say, but was Bolsonaro who do that? And then he say, oh, no, it's okay, don't have any more rights. It's pretty much about we are pro-Bolsonaro or anti-Bolsonaro, we are pro-PT or anti-PT, and Brazil is dividing this two balloons. I think part fragmentation, going to the deal, I think part fragmentation are a big issue in Brazil, not only about how you make the decisions harder than with a small number of actors in the political system. The part fragmentation changed the main political forces, just not only because we have so many parties in the Congress, but because we have different actors in the Congress. And the party fragmentation make the party leaders, oh my God, what's the word? It's make the party leaders not stronger as them are before, and that make the individuals in the Congress, the congressmen and the congresswomen, more capable to ask for things from the executive, and that we don't have no one. We in this moment in Brazil, the coordination in the Congress is really a tough work, because the leaders don't have the power to make the arrangements, the alliance, and that make the decisions really harder. Let Danilo talk a little, and then I can talk more about religious force.
Okay, so it's a great question, Carlos. We actually have many balloons going on right now, but the thing is, so I think the question is if we have unidimensional politics or a bidimensional politics or a multidimensional political system. At least the data are showing that we have in Brazil and in the US a unidimensional political system. It was not true. This was not true for the US before the 1960s. So the data showed that the politics in the US were bidimensional until the civic rights movement. And this changed once this issue was kind of, although racism is not solved, but the issue was solved in the institutional politics. And then you have like these two dimensions, they just converge to one dimension that is liberal conservative. In Brazil, it's kind of the same. You have like people have different balloons, different issues that they care about. They have very strong views on. But as Andrea mentioned, basically all these views are flattened by these liberal conservative, or maybe liberal conservative is not the best word in Brazil, as in the US, maybe progressive conservative or just left and right, the left to right spectrum continuum. So these views are kind of this group of people who care about different issues and have different views on these issues. They are somewhat organized between these two poles, these two blocks, right? You have a big block on the right, a big block on the left. It doesn't mean that these blocks are super homogeneous, right? You can have a lot of heterogeneity within these blocks, but in what matters, like especially when we talk about the elections and what's going on in Congress, they are organized through these left and right continuum. Because and this is anchored in a discussion about the system of beliefs, the idea that when someone answer 1, 2, 3, 4 questions about some issues that matters or some issues that are polarized, you can infer their positions on almost all other issues based on answers for 1, 2, or 3, or 4 questions. And the people within these blocks will agree at least in many issues. Maybe not in all, but in many other issues. So but there is also a question about the religious forces, right? There's some noise here, sorry. So this is an important, very important question for especially Brazil right now. My guess, and just a guess, and it's just a guess. This is an issue. Sorry, guys, there's a lot of noise going on here. So I kind of lost my concentration. Just 1 second. So the religious forces are showing to maybe force this unidimensional system to move to a bidimensional politics. There's some data for this for the Bolsonaro presidency right now that's showing that there are some dispersion of voters and also politicians from the same party or from the same bloc within a second dimension that we couldn't really identify exactly. And this may be the influence of religious forces in Brazil. But I guess we need more research and understand, because there's also some research that has been published lately showing that maybe what is affecting the views, at least of the voters, is a story about religious views more than class-based views. But we need more research to understand the relationship between class-based views and religious views. And it's important to notice that religion was pointed out as one of the reasons why both the Workers' Party and the PSDB, the Social Democrats, lost votes in places where they used to get many votes. But there is this Bolsonaro effect that I guess the Brazilian political science is still trying to figure out what happened in 2018. But it was mentioned, or at least pointed out, that one of the reasons was the influence of religion in the elections. So this, especially the Workers' Party, who were used to get many votes in the Northeast, lost some of these votes due to the influence of religion views, and not only religion views, but the actions and decisions of politicians and forces related to Pentecostal leadership. And I guess this is it. It's just a guess. I'm not sure of what's going on with this religion variable.
So we have a question now from Andreina. I also received a question from Isabelle in the chat, and someone also asked a question. So could we ask the three and then both of you respond? Andreina, you first, please.
Thank you so much. That was great, both presentations. I think, from my own research in Venezuela, it's very useful to think about polarization as this global phenomenon, right? Which I hadn't really thought about, and then more of a regional phenomenon, right? Like what conditions in Latin America are pushing this polarization. And since you mentioned like economic inequality as one of the factors, I wonder if there's any research being done in terms of connecting these waves of like the economic development, right? That what do we have in common in Latin America, right? Like our economic development models, extractivism, and like these waves of, like the commodity boom in the 2000s, like the increase in consumption-based kinds of forms of inclusion, and then the bust moment where all that kind of goes away, and at least in Venezuela, that's where you see a more the intensification of polarization with some very specific elements like the death of Chavez and how that affected. But then you have like these more macro elements, which are like, the failure of this consumption-based kind of forms of inclusion, and then political actors kind of finding the opportunity to become radicalized. And I don't know, I'm kind of extrapolating from my own research, but I wonder if those questions are also being asked in terms of an understanding polarization in Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you, Andreina. I will read Isabel's question here, which is on the chat. If you want to, no, she just sent to me. So regarding the 2022 presidential election, would Professor Buscato and Freitas agree that we can expect less polarization in a more common sense? How can we interpret in this dimension the initiative of former President Lula and former Governor Alckmin running together? Can we expect a Congress less polarized in the next term? And then the last question from Samuel. This is less of a direct question and more a request, if time allows, for Danilo and Andrea to talk about a point on one of Danilo's last final slides regarding historical conditions that led the elite or middle class to resist changes to power structure social hierarchies. Could you talk a little bit more extensively about those structures and hierarchies?
I can go first. I will answer Andreina and Isabel's questions, then I'll return to Andrea so she can answer those questions too, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the point that Samuel asked about. So the intensification of polarization this is kind of a dance, right? So for example, in the US, some research showed that the Republican Party, for instance, moved to the right before the Democrats moved to the left. And both in voters' views, or Republican voters' views, but and also in the strategies of party leaders, party bosses, and legislators in general. And then it's a dance in the sense of who makes the first movement, right? So can we say that the Democratic Party moved to the left because the Republican Party moved to the right? We actually don't know that. We don't have an answer, a clear answer for that. It might be so, but it might not. And as you mentioned, parties may be polarized, and party leaders, party bosses decide to polarize in order to get some advantage. Can be electoral advantage, mostly electoral advantage. So this is part of a strategy, and it's part of a dance in the sense of who reads better voters' perceptions, voters' ideals. But we have to take into account also the political institutions, right? So this game, this dance, so this dance is being played in the dance floor, and the dance floor has some formal and informal rules. In our case here is political institutions, right? So you have other players, other dancers around. You have music that's playing on, and you kind of have to dance to the beat of that music. You have the limitation of the space. But for the political institutions, you have to consider, for example, how the electoral system is designed. So in the US, what matters is like one of the issues that can affect polarization, because it can affect the behavior of political actors, is gerrymandering. So how the districts are designed and who are the voters in which districts. So these kind of things matters on whether we are selecting more more moderate or more extreme legislators. So in Venezuela, I guess, and in Latin America, parties are also strategizing in the same sense. And here the economy plays an important role in defining how inequality can affect the lives or the well-being of voters, right? And this will be combined with the institutional structure to define how parties can approach voters, and how parties can define a strategy based on how the socioeconomic transformations are affecting the views of these voters. So the okay, Anna told me that I have 1 minute to so I'll just interact with Isabel's question a little bit. So 2000, so this year's elections, my guess is that we will face a depolarization in the next legislature, although not during election, right? The elections will, at least in the common sense, will be very polarized. And then the media will play a role here. We'll have to see if they will present the main players of this dance, the main dancers of this dance, as equals, in the sense of they are both occupying the extremes, right? And I guess this will be decisive. And what Lula and Alckmin are trying to do here in forming this weird coalition is to show to voters and the media as well that they are not in the same extreme as Bolsonaro, right? They want to present Bolsonaro as someone occupying the very far extreme of the ideological continuum, and Lula is trying to present himself as someone who are capable to approach the moderates, and as he was for basically most of his presidency, right? So Lula's government coalition was formed by parties, including parties on the right, but this is a very stark demonstration that he's going to do that. So his ticket is composed by someone who opposed him for most of his political life. But I don't know. I'm not very good of seeing the future. I don't know. I just feel that at least in the legislature, there's a space to avoid these effects that Bolsonaro played in the last election.
I'm not so optimistic as Danilo. um, the the polarization in Brazil has this curious effect because it's pretty much, I don't know if Danilo agree with me, but I think it's pretty much a decision of the political elites. When the movement in 2013 in the mass protests in Brazil start, a lot of elite groups try to capturate this movement to increase his electoral potential. And then the polarization really starts by a movement or by a decision of the elites, and not really about things or issues that are discussing in the society. But that spread for the society. The elites make a move, and now they are in now the issues are mobilizing the society. Issues that is previous did not seem to be important in Brazil are making people fight in the streets. It's pretty much about that. Like vaccines, like I don't know, we can talk about a lot of issues that was really not important, then start to be a question of life or death for many Brazilians. Then I think we still see that in the next legislature. I think Bolsonaro has a lot of electoral chances. And I think he electoral success or not will bring to the Congress a lot of people who think like him. And we still have a polarized legislature and a polarized between the left and the right and the radical right in the next legislature. And I don't think the problems in Brazil will solve in the next election. I think we still have to live with that for many years. Because this politics, us versus them, turning possible the minimal consensus between democracy, and that I think was the big question. And what is the result of this impossible consensus was the big question for Brazil in the next, I don't know, 10 years, 12 years, 20 years, I don't know. We talk about the things in Venezuela. Has a great article, great paper about that with Daniela Campelo, that shows the boom of commodities have a great effect in Brazil, and the behavior pro-PT or pro-PT, and also she presents that when the commodities go down, that have an effect on the acceptance of the Dilma's government. But I think the problem is not that linear. Because we have so many changes in the Brazilian society that make this answer really hard. It's not just about social. It's not about economics, only about economics. It's about something that is more profound, that divides the society, that was put between the, I don't know how to say that in English, but put it between the carpet. I don't know that expression, probably don't exist in English. But Danilo can say, maybe can say what I'm trying to do. We have this big issue that was not visible, but now we're in the middle of the room, and we have to try to lead with that. After we can go further, if we want to stay as a democracy. So I think it's that. Anna?
Okay, so thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you very much, Danilo. Thank you very much, Andreina, and all the Clackles folks for organizing it. Yeah, I think that's it. Andreina, do you want to say something to wrap up?
No. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Danilo, for being our visiting fellow, and Andrea for accepting our invitation. And of course, Anna, thank you so much for moderating the event today.
Thank you, everyone.
We will upload the recording to our YouTube channel, so you can in case you want to share it with others after the event.
Thank you, guys. Thank you all for organizing this. It was great. Thank you for the opportunity. And sorry if I spoke too much.
It's fine.
Thank you for the opportunity. Bye-bye, guys. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.